Welcome back to Sarcurious.
Today, we are talking about pleats.
Honestly, Chandler, before we get started, I think it's just a little silly that we picked this episode to be our first one because there's so much here. And what are the coincidences that the first thing that we choose to talk about is also one of the oldest pieces of fashion history? I kind of love that. Not intended, but a cool coincidence.
100%. And it just means that we have so much to try to pare down into one episode. So hopefully this is digestible, but we could literally talk about this topic for an 8-episode series. So we are doing at least 2 of these,
Yeah.
but I think we're going to try to hold it to 2.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we hop in, I want to hear how your trip was.
Oh, okay. Honestly, my favorite part of the trip. So we went up to Lake Tahoe, hiking, biking. It was beautiful. I know a lot of people love to ski. I can't at all. I never learned, and I feel like it's one of those things now that it's almost too late unless I take 4 weeks off of work and go somewhere to learn it. But I don't know. I just love being out there. It's just like such a breath of fresh air, and I needed that. It's been a minute. Yeah.
Nice. I didn't realize there was enough snow to be skiing there right now because it was such a dry season.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing that was odd that we noticed when we went up, because we also stopped by and saw some family, was the poppies, the California poppies were in bloom, and usually they come out in May. So obviously a super weird season, just like not a lot of snow. And then the grass is blooming a lot sooner than expected. But
That's nuts.
yeah.
Yeah, you would never know it by how pale I am, but I was just in Colombia for a week, which was really fun. There was 70 of us, which is insane. And given how many people we had, I feel like we made it out pretty well. We had one wild dog bite. One person stepped on a sea urchin and had to go to the hospital. And then we had like 4 bouts of food poisoning, but none of the above were me. So I will take that and run, and no sunburns.
There you go. Favorite highlight of the trip, if you could pick one.
Oh
Or
man, we
one
did a
thing that you learned that you liked, didn't expect.
Didn't expect. Bogota is a big business center, and I didn't expect it to feel as corporate as it did, but that also depends what neighborhood you're in. And then I would say Cartagena, it was probably the highlight. It's just really beautiful. It's where the Spanish set up a really large city wall and all these forts. So the old town was just gorgeous. It was
History nerd
fun.
coming out.
Speaking of history, maybe should talk about some pleats. As we mentioned, pleats show up everywhere and there's different types. They do different jobs. So we are going to be doing 2 episodes on pleats and kind of splitting them into 2 groups to help us do that. So this episode, Pleats to Plissé, we're talking about pleats that behave more like a surface. So they're adding texture and movement to a garment, but they're not really creating the shape of the garment on their own. So think of them more of the texture of the fabric rather than creating the shape of the fabric. Our other pleats episode is more on classic pleats, where those pleats are actually creating the shape of that garment. Think of more like accordion pleats, box pleats, knife pleats, but now we're going to define kind of the types of pleats we're talking about. So first is sunburst pleats. These are radiating pleats that widen towards the hem. If you think of a summery skirt that has pleats in it, this is probably what pops into your head. And we'll get more into this later, but these are also, if you know the name Mariano Fortuny e Madrazo, this is probably also what pops into your head. And then we're also talking about crystal pleats, which are these micro pleats that were perfected by Issey Miyake for wrinkle-resistant garments. And then finally, plissé, which is a lightweight textured fabric that is made applying heat to permanently crinkle / pleat the fabric. So these are usually made of, it can be cotton, polyester, silk, rayon, a lot of different types of fabrics.
I wore pleats for you today. And to your point, this one, I don't know if you can really see it, but it has a bit of a puff sleeve. But
Yeah.
I don't think the pleat itself is creating that here. That's in the garment. But it is very pleated. And I'm sorry, I didn't take off my garment for you. I'll do it next time.
I would expect nothing less.
There's so many, and I feel like you just covered probably the 3 most. The 3 that we see the most in this category, but a lot
Yes.
there.
And I would say those 3 in a modern context are all created using heat, which is relevant. But let's go back to the very beginning of pleats and also the world's fashion, which is the oldest woven garment, which is the Tarkan dress. So we're talking about ancient Egypt here. And this dress dates back to over 5,000 years ago. And it's pleated. And it's the oldest piece of clothing that we have as humans, which is crazy. Obviously, they were wearing things before that, but this is the oldest surviving piece. So it's a linen v-neck dress and it has pleated sleeves. And it was found in 1913 in the Tarkan Necropolis, which is south of Cairo. It's really cool. If you're not on the video, you should look it up or go watch the video because it's insane.
When I look at it, it isn't one color. I don't know if that's just sweat that it's accumulated over its life, if that's aging, but you still see the pleat, which is so unique in my opinion.
It's so cool. It's crazy how dry those Egyptian tombs were. Like they were bone dry, and that's why everything was preserved so well. The next one you can see is insanely well preserved. It's 4,200 years old, and it's from a tomb in Naga el Dir. And you can see like it's a full dress. It has long sleeves. The shape's kind of formless, but the entire thing is pleated. So how they did this was the pleating was likely done by hand before they actually assembled the garment, and then they would wear it and then re-pleat it every time it was worn. So they would do the hand pleating, and then we don't know exactly how, but somehow they were able to press those pleats into place, probably a mixture of chemicals and some sort of pressing.
And that's every time.
Yes, every time it was worn, it would be repleated. So, as you can imagine, this was something the wealthier people were doing, which I have one more example of, which is the famous King Tut. I feel like we all had our King Tut phase in middle school. But so Egyptian men wore pleated kilts, which were called shendits. And this is a relief that was found in his throne room, where you can see a picture of him and his half sister slash consort, and they are both donning their pleats. His is on his shendit, which is that kind of kilt looking skirt. And this was throughout the Old and New Kingdom. So they wore these pleats for a really long time. But what I also think is cool is they could be, the linen was so fine, it was actually translucent. So a little transparent. So what you think of modern day chiffon.
I'm trying to think about how like this being transparent actually felt. Like, was that normal back then, would you say?
I think so, because it was so hot that I think it was in an effort to have the fabrics be
Yeah.
lighter. I don't know if it was how much it was showing. Like, I'm not sure if people were walking around with everything on display or if it was the pleats made it layered so it was less transparent. I kind of imagine that it was probably little glimpses as opposed to everything being out there, but who's to say? But we do see a different but similar kind of pleat happening also in ancient Greece. So they had two main garments that were pleated. First, I'm going to talk about the peplos, which was worn earlier and usually made of a heavier wool. So here we're talking about the 7th century BC through the classical period. And it's this big piece of cloth, it's a rectangle. And then they would fold the top over to form this deep cuff, which was called an apoptygma. And then they fasten them on the shoulders with these things called fibulae, which were brooches like mine here. So clearly those have continued from antiquity as well. But these were broader pleats. It's made by how you're laying the fabric. So it's not necessarily being pressed the way that the Egyptians were doing, but they were gathering with the fibulae to create these pleats that kind of ran down the garments.
That's crazy to me, honestly. Considering that brooches are back or fibulae are back. Let's refer to them as they are. I tried to actually pin a blouse with a brooch, and we were running late to dinner as expected and didn't end up doing it because I, like, couldn't get it to work. So the fact that what we're seeing in this photo was held up by a fibulae/brooch, I have a hard time wrapping my mind around that. I feel like that takes so much skill. Granted, maybe you were doing it every day, so it becomes something like second nature, like tying a tie for the first time when you do it, but yeah. I love your brooch, by the way. Very cute.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a feeling theirs were probably looks pretty different than this guy. But yeah, it's very cool that they were using those. And that's another thing that we've carried through history. And I know like other cultures also that's super relevant. So maybe a brooch episode is in our future. We will see.
I like it.
So the Greeks also had the chiton, which is another garment super similar, but it doesn't have that apoptygma, which was that overlayer. So that's a similar time period. It was the Archaic through the Hellenistic, which is 750 through 730 BC. And it's also more of the gathering. So I would say if you were to compare the two, then the peplos had more of actual uniform pleating, while the chiton was even more about kind of gathering and draping the fabrics. So chiton were worn by both men and women, and
Okay.
then also were fastened with pins or brooches and were belted at the waist. As far as who was wearing them, a lot of people, but the wealthy people were wearing them made of a finer linen that could be more delicately folded to create those vertical pleats.
Question for you. When we were looking back at the Egyptians, we saw in the Tarkan dress, the other one from the unnamed tomb, and then the photo you showed of King Tut. There was a lot more color in the outfit of King Tut. And I'm just curious, in the chiton, was there any difference in coloring, or was almost that like symbol of wealth that you might have seen in the Egyptians and the difference of their embroidery and color coming out here in the fabric that's used?
Yeah, so I only saw light white fabrics, but
Mm.
also so much of what we know about Greek clothing was from marble statues. So I'm not sure
Yeah.
if that's just because those are most the images I'm seeing, and that's how it was portrayed, or if they were doing a lot of dyeing of the fabrics. I do know the Romans used dyes as like a social stratification thing. So we'll talk a tiny bit about that. As far as the social relevance of these things, the ancient Greeks, the pleats were tied to that idea of harmony and proportion. So you're revealing a little bit, but concealing at the same time with how it's pinned and all of that. So there's enough flow to show the shape of the body, but it's still some concealment happening. And it's just very human centric. Flowy, what do you think when you think Greece? What's also cool though is that the Greek fashion was actually influenced by Egyptian dress because there was trade happening between the two. As you go along in history, you start seeing more linens occurring in Greece and moving away from that wool that they wore earlier because they were trading with the Egyptians who had this long established linen industry. So as you move on, finer, lighter linens get more common, which is what they were using in the chiton.
Okay.
Very cool. So,
Very
speaking of the Romans, a couple garments we're going to talk about. Basically, your layman, everyday, not wealthy person is wearing what they called a tunica, which is when you think tunic, pretty much what you would picture. They were worn by laborers. It's just a box of fabric.
Okay.
And they would belt them. But the men's were usually knee length and women's were floor length. And it was pretty plain. But as far as the actual citizens, so not everybody was a citizen in Rome. And you had to be like a free male, essentially, to be a citizen. And only they were allowed to wear togas. So the Roman toga was a big semicircular piece of cloth that were worn over the tunic. So if everyone wore the tunic, but you would wear a toga over the top if you were a citizen. What's interesting is women did not wear them except in certain rituals, or if they were a prostitute, they would wear them as a sign of a stigma. I feel like it's interesting to stigmatize women by putting them in men's clothing.
Yeah. And even just the whole idea of how this fabric is so historic, but if you're going through and looking at some of this history that you're talking us through, a lot of that history is also about segregation of a class in a way. And this technique has been around for so long, but it's also a little bit, like, I don't know, disheartening, honestly, that a lot of the history that we're walking through is also like, hey, only wealthy people could afford to redo this every time it was washed, and this is how classes were segregated.
Yeah. I agree, but what I do think is exciting, and obviously we'll talk about this a lot later, is these pleats, they were worn by the wealthy because they required more fabric, but everyone can wear that now, which is kind of cool. The things that used to be reserved for only the ultra wealthy now are way more accessible as fashions moved forward. But I know I mentioned the Romans have colors. So I know that some Romans wore purple. I think it might have been
Mhm.
if you were in the Senate, but I'm not entirely sure. So I might have to give that a fact check, but that's my recollection. And these togas, as far as what the pleats looked like, it was essentially just how they were draped. So it was a lot of fabric that you were draping to create, again, those vertical pleats. And then moving on to Roman women, married Roman women wore what was called a stola, which is a long pleated dress that was worn over the tunic. I know we just talked about the chiton. It's pretty similar. They're long, pretty voluminous, and had these vertical pleats, which were called rugae. Vitruvius, who you've probably heard of, he was a Roman architect during the
Mhm.
first century BC. But he had this quote where he basically compared the vertical pleating to the fluting on Doric columns. So if you imagine like the Parthenon and it has all those fluted columns, he made the comparison, which I just thought was cool because it shows how interconnected fashion was with architecture.
Yeah, almost like a chicken or the egg, right? Kind of, like, which came first? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I think the idea was they found so much elegance in it that they wanted it incorporated, which if you can see the photo, they are pretty cool looking. So, but what I thought was cool about these two is that there's some evidence that they were actually processed similarly to the Egyptian pleats and were set more permanently. I read a little bit of a book about it, which was called Roman Women's Dress, Literary Sources, Terminology, and Historical Development. But basically, the authors called it a special processing of the fabric, which were trimmed, ironed, and belted into place, the pleats. And there's actually a Latin term, which is plicatrix, that might refer to a female ironer who specialized in creating these pleats. So that's kind of more along the lines of the Egyptians, but it's hard to know because we don't have any surviving stolas. So we don't have a Tarkan dress that we can refer back to. But yeah, basically for the Greeks, it was mostly draping and then potentially some pressing happening in the Roman context. But slight differences between all three, mostly the Greeks and Romans, whereas the Egyptians, we know for sure those were set into place. But that's end of Warback antiquity.
Yeah.
So now we're jumping to medieval Europe. So
Yeah.
bit of a jump in time, but I'm happy to talk about medieval Europe because I feel like it's very often overlooked in history in general and of course fashion history. So I thought this was fun to be able to talk a little bit about and to do some research on. So there was this garment called the bliot, which was worn by both men and women in the 11th and 12th centuries in Western Europe. They're particularly common in France, but you would see them in like Italy and a couple other countries as well. So this was worn by the nobility. And I feel like if you pictures a fine lady in the Middle Ages, this is probably pretty similar to what pops into your head. It's a really long dress with it could have a V-neck, but it wasn't a lot of skin, and then really long, voluminous sleeves. Basically, the pleats come in because they were cinched tightly at the waist, and then pleats were seen along that waistband, and the sleeves could also be pleated. So both men and women wore them, although the women's were long flowing skirts, tight bodices, and the men's were more of like a tunic with a fitted torso, but then a fuller skirt that wasn't as long so that they could move around more. And then the wealthier you are, the more elaborate the fabric would be. So they were importing textiles when you could see embroidery, really beautiful fabrics happening because there was a lot of trade happening by that point. Basically, the more fabric you could afford, the more pleats you're going to have. And then it's kind of emphasizing, not dissimilar from the Greeks in that it wasn't about movement and this interplay of concealment slash showing some skin, but it was still about like lines and elegance and controlled volume. So that is the Middle Ages. And then we're going to do another jump to the Balkans, so back towards Greece. And now we're in the 18th and 19th centuries. So we're going to talk about some warriors, which is interesting when you think about pleats. But basically, there's this garment called the fustanella. It's claimed by both the Albanians and the Greeks as their kind of cultural garb, their national costume. So the Albanians wore it during the Ottoman Empire. And then there were also Greek fighters during the Greek War of Independence that were wearing it. So that's 19th century. In Greece, there's a short version that's worn by ceremonial military units. And then in Albania, it's worn by the Royal Guard, particularly between World War I and II. But like I said, they're both claimed as a national costume for both countries.
If you look at the photo, and this is the comparison is, I'm drawing it out, but it does kind of look like a wedding gown, at least like the bottom half of one, if you could see it fully extended in a way. If you were to take an A-line and a pleated bottom, that looks very similar to this in my opinion.
Yep.
Really interesting that this is like obviously a hyper masculine position to be in, and they are wearing a pleated skirt. Very
Yeah.
different than how you'd think about it today.
100%. But what's interesting is that's shared across cultures, which I'll talk a little bit about. But I think the reason for it is it can kind of be traced back to Roman military dress. So the Romans were doing this for so long and had such an influence in that part of the world that it just was a through line. So there's this, call it a theory, because I don't know if we've proved this, but some scholars do think that the Scottish kilt, which has pleats, has the same background and can also be traced from the Romans. And so that gets us to the Scottish kilt, which we're talking about mostly Scotland and Ireland, so I'll call it Celtic, but it can be traced back to the 16th century as the Great Kilt, which was this massive piece of tartan. So it was big enough that you could use the bottom half to make a kilt, which is like a skirt, and then the top half would be wrapped around you and worn as a cloak, and you could pull it over your head if it was raining. So that thing was big.
I would love something like that.
I feel like it'd be so handy.
I don't know. I would also need to fact check myself here. I'm curious if anyone's ever brought an idea like that out on the runway. A
Mm.
kilt that has that utilitarian aspect. Food for thought.
I don't know if I've seen a kilt like that, but I've definitely seen Oscars red carpets where a dress had a hood incorporated within the garment itself, where it like
Mm,
wraps all the way around, which I think is very cool. And who knows, maybe that was the inspiration. But the great kilt eventually became the small kilt or modern kilt in the 18th century, which is more or less the bottom half of the great kilt. And since the 19th century, those kilts have been associated with the wider culture of Scotland and the Gaelic language and Celtic heritage. The way they're made is basically you would lay it out on the ground and do all the hand pleating and then
mhm.
throw a belt in there, pick it up, and all the pleats would be in place, and then you would belt it on. Um,
Okay.
Modern day ones, the pleats are sewn in, so you're not hand gathering them every time, but I would definitely recommend hopping on TikTok and looking up a video of somebody laying out those pleats by hand because it's very cool.
Okay. That's on my to-do list after this.
It's super cool. So, those are all the ones I'm going to go into detail with. There are lots of other pleats in history. We're talking Japan, China, Korea, more in medieval Europe, South Africa. So, we'll hold on to a lot of those for our other pleats episode because they're a little bit more structured pleats and less about laying things out, belting, fibulae, the whole nine. So, that's it for then, now we're going to do another time jump to the 20th century where we're going to talk about the Delphos gown. So, I feel like Joanna, you're pretty familiar, but I mentioned earlier Fortuny. So, basically, there was this man, Mariano Fortuny y Madrazo, and then his wife was a designer named Henriette Negrin, and they together created the Delphos gown. So, he credited her as being the designer of the gown, and then the patent for the actual fabric is under his name. So it's a patented way of creating pleats, more or less. And the gown is named the Delphos after the Greek statue, the charioteer of Delphi.
You said it was patented, and correct me if I'm wrong, but, like, we've no idea how it's made.
Yeah, so he filed his patent in 1909 with Henrietta credited on it, but to this day, it's a closely guarded secret exactly how those pleats are made. We know it's a unique heat set pleating process that allowed silk to retain permanent fine vertical pleats. So when I say fine, they're like tiny. They're 1 to 2 millimeters. They're very narrow. The entire garment's pleated from neckline to hem. Those vertical pleats go all the way down. And it was, again, started being manufactured in 1909 when he filed that patent. And then it was actually manufactured all the way through 1950. And then he also made a gown called the peplos, talking about peplos we just discussed, which had a shorter tunic layer. So that's referencing that apoptygma that I was telling you about. And they're stunning. If you look at the image, they're beautiful gowns, and the hems of them have these little strings of Venetian beads that are both beautiful but also help to weigh the dress down, giving it shape and allowing it to skim across the body because that
Mhm.
silk is very lightweight, so it could use a little bit of grounding. What's really interesting about it is it was originally meant to be worn without underwear, which if you think about like 20th century women is a little racy. Basically, women were serving an afternoon tea a lot of the times inside of their homes. So this was meant to be worn while serving afternoon tea without any undergarments on.
When you say afternoon tea too, I feel like again, I'm assuming this is a silk pleated gown. This is a patented way of pleating silk that has never been done. Like, the consumer of this is also of a wealthy class, again.
Yes, for sure. They go for crazy amounts of money nowadays. Like you can only really find them on First Dibs. There's one that's housed at the Met. So it's Very hard to find now, but even back then, they were definitely meant for the wealthy. And what's funny though is they might have been meant to be worn inside the house without underwear on, but they actually became a stylish evening gown. A lot of women were still wearing corsets, everything was still very rigid, buttoned up, but the artistic type started wearing this gown in a bit of a racy way. So actresses like Sarah Bernhardt, the famous dancer Isadora Duncan were wearing them out and about. By the time we get to the 1920s, you also see a lot of Hollywood stars wearing these. So Lillian Gish wore it in the 20s. And then it was featured in a Downton Abbey episode in 2015, which is cool to see they're still relevant. Obviously, that's a historical show, but they're not pulling a bunch of gowns like that to be worn.
It was an actual Fortuny gown.
Yeah, very cool. It was worn by Mary Crawley. She's a fun character, so I'm glad they put it on her. The purpose of the gown is to celebrate beauty and proportion and to emphasize the natural lines of a woman's body. It doesn't constrict your movement. It's about the grace of the human form, very similar to what the Greeks were doing. So he named it very aptly. And it's just about rejecting strict social conventions. So once we get Fortuny, we're kind of off to the races with these heat set pleats. So in the 20s and 30s, we see industrial pleating machines popping up, which could make graduated pleats no longer by hand. This is when you start seeing synthetic fibers being used as opposed to just silk like Fortuny was using. And they would heat set these pleats very reliably, and they wouldn't need to be repleated over and over again. And also, just as a society, we were moving more towards freedom of movement. Dance was very popular. Hollywood was taking off. So within all of that, these kind of fabrics were becoming more and more popular. And then I did see a really cool TikTok about this. The algorithm definitely knew I'd been doing my research.
When we were preparing for this, I would get on Instagram, TikTok, and I would just need to send you something because we could never be done researching. It was always, it threw something at us that we're like, oh, look at this really niche designer that's up and coming and has like 1,000 followers on TikTok that is creating really cool pleats by hand. So crazy.
No, literally, this could be the only thing we talk about on this podcast. It's insane.
Yeah.
But the one that I saw was about these pleating houses that basically popped up. So the specific one I came across was called Tom's Sons International Pleating, which is in the Garment District in New York. But it's been around since 1931. And it's just an example of these kind of legacy pleating houses that came up after Fortuny. So Tom's Sons has 5 generations of pleating expertise, and they specialize in silk and couture, but they can use all kinds of textiles like polyester, cotton, nylon, even leather, which is very cool. But they work with costuming, Hollywood, all of the above, red carpets, and just make these really incredible garments that are very specialized. So pleating is alive and well.
I love how you just walked us, honestly stepped us through history with all of that. But also, even in the story that you just told, this was a very difficult thing to do that required a lot of labor. And with Delphos, you're seeing celebrities buy into this expensive gown. Then the public want it, and you're seeing these houses pop up. The message of pleats today has changed, which is why I think it's so relevant still, which kind of leads us into our next topic of now that we know how this has evolved, why do we still care about it? Why are we still using it? And there's definitely like many different ways to structure why pleats are relevant today, but let me give you a curated tour of how you want to thought about it in, I would say, three ways. I think to your point, the first is just bringing the sense of this personalized belonging. Then that moves into just the kineticism and the freedom and kind of release that pleats have is kind of that second theme. And then lastly, they do encode this craft and time invested in labor and this preservation of human skill. I think especially as across the runway, you're seeing kind of a reversion to AI in general, a lot of the unperfect. I think pleats are a really good way to lean into that human craft. Before we dive into all of them, you mentioned synthetics really just democratize the ability to use a pleat. There's a tension with that, with sustainability, of course, because a lot of, I think, what enables that magic of the visual aesthetic, not needing to redo it every time it's washed, is at a more accessible consumer price is the use of polyester. It's a synthetic derived from fossil fuels. Obviously, there's a lot of contributions there with just like greenhouse gas emissions in general. I want to say it up front. We will touch on it a little bit more towards the end of the episode, but at least my hope is that as there's been attention being brought into how the fashion industry adopts different practices, I think this is such a unique fabric. So, hoping to see more of a move to allow us to enjoy it while minimizing that impact it currently has to our planet.
Yeah, synthetics are tough because they do have their time and place. It's just when it starts being fast fashion and these things are being worn twice and they fall apart that you really get into that problem with it. But even couture houses occasionally use synthetics. There's some
Yeah.
things that they just do better than natural fibers. And there's ways to do it sustainably, and there's ways to not do it sustainably. So I don't think you'll ever hear us hands down be like, no synthetics and just completely ignore them. But it's worth mentioning that they should be considered and the impact that they have.
And to your point, I mean, I don't have any fast fashion examples in this, in what I'm going to walk us through, but there's so many examples of pleats
Yeah.
today. There's so many we could have pulled from. Couture houses, smaller designers, even costumes, right? Fast fashion. Honestly, I picked the ones that, based on these themes, really grabbed my attention. So if you guys are listening to this, you have some examples that you're excited to share with us in the comments or continue the dialogue, but let's get into it. So the first one really is this way of pleats being a mechanism to show mass individuality and lean into, to your point with the Delphos gown, how they shape to your body. On paper, these garments should be super, super generic. If you lay them down flat, right, they're machine made. My pleats in your closet look the same as yours. As I was doing the research, there was this one quote that really stuck out to me, and it kind of helped me really solidify this idea of the first theme. It was from another mag. There's a capital in the O on that other. So I think that's how you add the intonation on it. But it's from Charlene Prempe, who's a founder of a vibe called Tech. And in this article, it's all about why four women love wearing Issei Miyake's Pleats Please collection. And for those of you that have been listening that have been like, why haven't you brought up Miyake yet? It's about that time. I think this quote is a really good way to lean into that. So Prempe says, I love the idea that I'll be wearing it in my mid-20s and my mid-80s because not only does it move with your body, with your body's shape, it moves with your life. I can't think of many other brands capable of doing that.
I love that. Yeah, I feel like to your point of how they look different on everybody, I have this amazing tailor in New Jersey who has she said to me once, you know, it came in and it looked nice, but now it looks like it's yours, meaning clothing that's well tailored looks like it's meant for you. But I've never taken her a pleated piece because they already look like they're mine. Just the way that the fabric sits on your body. And the whole thing with plissé is that you don't need it to be tailored because your body is doing the heavy lifting. And I feel like that's so much of what Miyake's work is about.
Yeah. You are the one person that made me believe in tailoring and getting my clothes tailored. So the fact that you haven't tailored a pleated piece is interesting. That says a lot for those of you that are maybe listening to this and don't know us yet. That says a lot about Chandler. Says a lot about pleats. A lot of it too is how it makes you feel, but I do think we're in this kind of era of sameness. You'll go on TikTok and maybe to your point, like brooches are trending, right? And an influencer wore brooches, so now I'm going to go and vintage source a brooch. And I think Miyake's whole intention, whether or not you feel that pleats actually do this, that's up for debate. But his idea was it's one pattern, infinite stories to tell. It's kind of like yours to wear. I do want to, before we even talk about his two most famous collections, which are Pleats Please, On Plissé, I want to pause and just acknowledge one part of his personal story. It's really tragic, but at 7 years old, Miyake survived the Hiroshima atomic bombing, and he lost his mother to radiation exposure when he was 10.
Wow.
Yeah. And he rarely spoke about it in public. He rarely spoke about the war. And what I found, I just got chills as I'm
Yeah.
like about to say this next piece. Yeah, he's not public about it, but in 2009, he actually wrote a New York Times op-ed about it called A Flash of Memory. So it's written by Miyake. It's online.
That
Yeah.
just gave me chills too, that title.
Yeah. Yeah. He says that a lot of what defined how he became a designer was that he didn't want to be defined by the war. He wanted to create things that bring joy and a sense of future.
I was just gonna say that's wild that he went through that experience and managed to make art out of it and created what he has.
Even to your point with the history and how some of this in the past was about social classes, I think it's so interesting to see that connection. And there's such a deeply personal reason that he wanted these clothes to be for joy and for everyday life. So, the one thing highlighting that is the en plissé design philosophy, which is one of these lines, is this idea that it's founded on the technology of garment pleating to design and make everyday wear that's universal for the diversity of the wear. So it's wrinkle resistant, quick to dry, lightweight, to your point, but they're products that adapt to the wearer's body and they just bring out your individual personality. That's the mission statement of En Plissé.
Very cool. I love that. And I feel like it's such a through line with the Delphos. You can really see how these fabrics have done this for people through history. The Greeks were doing it, Delphos, Miyake. It's just, we're all the same. No matter how much time goes on and on, I feel like everybody's just still searching for the same things out of their clothes.
Yeah. Yeah. And with the Delphos, right, it caters to your body with those Venetian beads that are weighing it down. And two, with Miyake, he really wants the garment to be complete when you put it on. So when I was on the website, there's some runway examples from the collection archives. If you look at this photo, you're seeing runway models wearing the garments, but then at the top of the photo, you just have the garment not on anybody and it looks completely uniform. They don't have any life to them. So I just thought that was a unique play on this is them, this is just a piece of clothing. And now it's alive in a way.
Yeah, it's not complete until you have it on.
I love the idea and the philosophy and the democracy there. To be honest, though, Issey Miyake's designs are super expensive.
Yeah.
Even just one example, a basics tank, last time I checked, $275.
Okay.
Yeah, accessible compared to silk couture and a Delphos gown. Accessible for me and you to maybe wear on this podcast or just buy into. Maybe one day I don't know.
Not today.
Not today. The price is a little bit hard to swallow, but even just, like, looking at the screenshot of it, the one thing that still carries through at least is that nothing is also named. I don't know. Let's say you found that blazer that you're wearing online. I feel like a lot of brands or designers name a clothing after a friend. So it's, "Oh, this is a Chandler blouse," or, I don't know, the Galena gown, and everything on his website is basics gray number 10. It has a number. No name, so totally anonymous.
It's not complete until you wear it. And like every single piece is meant for the person. So why would you name it after somebody when it's not meant for just one person?
And that brings us, I think it brings the whole theme together because it is this mass individuality. And I think Miyake is the best example for it because it's not just a strategy that gets lost on the runway in the marketing and the naming of the product. It really carries through. So very neat.
That's so much intentionality, which you can look for it and find it, but if you don't look, you won't find it. And so it's really cool to see that executed so thoroughly.
And I think within Miyake too, a lot of his garments, Plissé in general, right? Just not Miyake, but there's so much movement. This idea of sort of anonymity in a way, also anonymity that is removed when you give a garment movement is what the next theme I wanted to talk about. And I do think it's important to split those out because there's one thing about how this intention of this garment is tailored to your body. And then there's something else about how a pleat moves or plissé that people are drawn to. So many designers are doing this, but I only found out about a new designer, Aries van Herpen, throughout this research. And not new in the sense that new up and coming, just I had not been aware of her work. And I thought that even though there's a lot of other pieces that speak to movement well, I think she does a really good job in articulating her design philosophy that pulls this theme together for me. It's really this idea of kineticism. Her design philosophy is it brings art, science, dance. I don't want to misspeak, but I think she was a dancer in her childhood, in the past. It's really unique that kineticism is her overarching thing. And one of the biggest through lines that you see across her runways is the use of plissé to really bring that to life.
Yeah, I'd never heard of her, but it's beautiful stuff. And it looks like dance in a garment. And the fact that she chooses plissé, which is a type of pleating, to achieve that, I think is just so cool.
Yeah, there's so many of her collections online, and I know when we were talking about this, I was like, "I don't even know which one to highlight because I wanna show an example," but if we look at this video from the August/Winter 2018-2019 collection, it's called Syntopia, you just see these tiny little pleats that they look like a bird's wing, literally,
So
and
cool.
it's beautiful, and it continues to be carried across different collections. You see it also in Roots of Rebirth, which is fungi inspired, so there's also this play on nature in all of her work.
That might be my favorite because it really if you think about the underside of a mushroom, those gills, they
Yeah.
remind me of pleats, and I feel like she really tapped into that and just did such a cool collection with that idea.
Yeah, there's so much more that we could fangirl with, especially maybe just because 'cause I'm fresh into learning about her, so I thought it was really fascinating, but I do think it speaks a lot to that idea, and you touched on this a little bit, of there's a cultural preference and a want to just feel free and express yourself, and especially, I don't know, it feels weird to say post-pandemic because it's 2026, but I think a lot of people are still feeling like that difference in a post-pandemic world, and pleats are just so expressive in a way that it's almost refreshing.
I almost associate them with vacation dressing. The times in life when I'm mostly wanting to feel free and just frolic, that's when I'm like, "Okay, let me grab something Plissé out of my closet," just 'cause
Totally.
it's, like, joyful almost.
That's a really good point. Vacation dressing is, yeah, like, you're relaxing, quite literally, you're, like, letting go.
You're
Um
frolicking.
You're frolicking. That reminds me of your bachelorette. We frolicked a lot, and oh my god, I think I was actually in a pleated gown. I was in a
You
pleated
were?
rainbow.
That's crazy.
Little
Wow, you
did I
really
know.
were. Here we are.
I loved God, that was so romantic. We should do an episode on Chandler's Bachelorette where I won't spoil too much, but we basically got this beautiful house in Savannah, and it had this, like, romantic love shack fancy theme that, like, echoed through the house, the activities. Such a You did such a good job.
Thank you. It was so fun. We'll see which episode that ends up being relevant in.
Yeah, see? We were just pulling out my list, taking notes on what we need to do next. We've got 2 already coming out of this, but let me bring us back. This one's a little bit different. I do wanna talk about, though, just the tech and the craft that's so inherent in pleating. Maybe, honestly, my favorite, if I had to pick, because I will use an example from Dior, and I think Dior right now, in the connection to Plissé, to your point, is kind of one you have to search for, but hopefully when I walk you through it, you buy into the fact that it's really neat. But as you talked about, so much of Plissé is engineering, architectural. On one side, now that there are these machines that allow us to create these pleats, they can come out at accessible price points, but you have these couture houses, independent designers spending like hundreds of hours pleating, pressing, testing, everything that you walked us through that was required to bring a pleat back to life in ancient Egypt, quite literally still to this day.
Yeah. Well, what is interesting about that is, in ancient Egypt, it was reserved for the wealthy, and I feel like that's another through line that we still see. Couture is that level that is so unattainable for the masses, but it's because it is a labor of love, and the fact that that's something that's still being carried out by today's top designers is just so cool.
Exactly on that point. I think as like houses change designers, when Anderson did his debut at Dior, what grabbed me is in this exclusive interview he did with Imran Ahmed at the Business of Fashion. It was a very, like, human interaction. Anderson was just talking about how there were such high stakes for this debut that he was doing, and the one thing he wanted to do was highlight how central craft was to Dior, and he even talked about before going to Dior, he saw couture as this thing that was glamorous, inaccessible aspect of fashion, and then he was brought into the 2 houses that Dior has. So they have 2 houses where they specialize in creating their garments, and he witnessed the amount of talent, attention that gives couture that name, and it hit him and it was like, "I need to highlight this and show it to the world in a way."
Yeah,
Um,
that's amazing. Plus, I think there's so much pride that goes into that work, and to give people the opportunity to showcase what they're capable of, quite literally just breathes care into that garment. And the result will show that so much more than just trying to design from a place of making something that's just gonna, like, drop jaws. Because what's jaw-dropping is the craftsmanship, and I think taking it back down to that level, you allow that to really shine.
To your point, it's like if you know, you know, right?
Yes.
And that was, I think, what he did with his opening look. It was this dress that had a pleated swirl, and in the interview, he says the fabric is why Dior is Dior, with no words. But if you didn't understand the talent required to make that, it just looks like a white dress, but it's
Yeah.
so complex.
Yep. It's very cool.
He talks about the tiny tool lines as almost like candy floss structures, which I thought was cute.
That's insane. Yeah,
Yeah,
you just never would get when you look at a garment like that, I'm just like, where would you even start? It's just pretty much incomprehensible to imagine creating that, and I'm so glad that's what he chose to highlight for his debut.
exactly. The link is I want to highlight the importance and the level of craft that is required to be Dior, and I'm gonna do that with pleats. Pleats is this perfect vehicle for tradition, handwork, science almost is really neat. But the other thing, I wanna do one more on Dior because, yes, Anderson is fascinating. He's not the only one. But if we stick to Dior specifically, which makes me excited because it talks about your connection and history with Greece, is an even earlier piece from Maria Grazia Chiori's shows is actually the spring 2020, interestingly named "What If Women Ruled the World?" And literally the whole show is peplos gowns and silhouettes resembling Greek
No
goddesses in a
way.
forefront. Yeah,
That's so cool.
yeah. And there's this video too of that show where in one of the ateliers, the atelier flow is one of them, which is the atelier for flowier fabrics. You kind of like see the work that goes into creating this effortless style and the zoom in on the hands of everybody working there. It's fascinating.
I love
Yeah.
it. I love that she saw that silhouette and those fabrics as a mark of power. It's just so cool, and I love that the Greeks gave that to us and that it's such a touchstone throughout all of fashion history, but even as recently as this collection and then with Anderson, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. So it doesn't go away to your point. Like, sure, is this still something that me and you can't really buy? Yes. But I think it's really unique to see how pleats are doing a lot of the quiet work, and it's almost quiet luxury in a way, and I don't know if the connection is super there, but quiet luxury, there's no labels, there's no logos, but it kinda speaks for itself. If you know, you know,
Mm,
and I think pleats are almost that.
100%. So, how were her collection, how was it constructed? Was it sewing or draping, or what did it look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in the video, you see that silk being pleated, and then it's literally just knotted.
She needed a
The
fibulae.
she Fair, yeah, but
So cool
even
because it is
it
the same yeah, as obviously the Greeks, we just talked about how much they pinned their garments, but they weren't sewing. They were mostly just pinning, draping, and she kind of took that to inspiration and made it her own, obviously, but that's fascinating. And also, you can see in the video that the fabrics are translucent, like we were talking about with the Egyptian linens.
I think she did a really good job. It's almost like I don't know her creative process, but it was so intentional that I would have to assume that there was a lot of deep history or just knowledge. Obviously, she's been in the industry for forever on like the history of pleats that connects to everything in a way, touches all aspects.
Yeah,
And I think everything Curie did is so beautiful, and there's so much intention there, and you can probably tell I'm kinda, like, romanticizing pleats and everything because I do think that they're so beautiful. As someone who also doesn't wear that many because it's not particularly, like, my style, I don't have the most feminine, flowy style, but I appreciate everything that comes with them. At the same time, I did just wanna close out with just acknowledging that it is something that now a lot of the ways that these pleats are created is through synthetics, and we are getting to a point in time where it's like pushing designers, engineers, brands to just ask some of those harder questions about what does smart clothing really look like? Not just smart for making you feel like you're in your body, but also smart in the sense of being less harmful to the planet. We're not going to
Yeah.
solve it in this episode. There's so many episodes that we could do, and also this technique is not the only one that uses synthetic fibers, but hopefully at least it's kind of giving you a glimpse into what some of those trade-offs are with pleats, and you're a little bit more aware of them next time you, I don't know, look at a tag or a care tag on your garment.
Yeah, I think it's always shop smart. There are times it doesn't make sense to buy a synthetic. If you're buying a sweater, maybe opt for a natural fiber, or at least mostly a natural fiber. But there are also times when synthetics do make sense, and like shop smart in terms of know what you're going to wear for a long time. A plissé blouse, if you gain 5 pounds, it's still going to fit you because of the way that the fabric moves and lives. And so if it's something that you know you will love for years to come, it will fit you for years to come. And the longer you wear your clothes, the more sustainable they are. So I think it's just one of those things that you have to kind of pay attention to when you're making purchases.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like those are my 3 things. I mean, I think, right, it's really individualistic. There's a kinetic attraction to it, and then there's this appreciation of human skill. And I think that kind of brings us to our 3rd pillar, which is how do we feel about these? Why are
I
you
feel
wearing them?
fired up.
Yeah. It's I wanna go
Yeah,
shopping.
no, for sure. I think I already mentioned a little bit that I associate them with vacation. But I kind of want to hear from you first. So you mentioned you want to go shopping. When you're looking at a pleated piece or when you pull ones that you own out of your closet, what's kind of going through your mind?
I think I'm not gonna lie, I am so not the kind of person that just is the most effortless. If I'm getting dressed up, I'm kinda going all out. Like, I'm in a heel, I'm wearing a belt, I'm accessorizing. It's a lot, and that's kinda my style.
Yeah.
I almost literally never learned how to do, "Oh, I just threw this on." I never knew how to do that. I think when I do talk about a closet cleanup, it's so hard because all of my closet is mostly, like, statement pieces, but
Yes.
it's really hard for Joanna to have a black, a gray, a white, neutral tank top that is always good to go. So it's almost easier for me to go over the top maximalist than minimalist. Um, and I think something pleated like this shirt, when I put it on, it just kinda works. And I don't have a lot of
Yeah.
I don't feel that way with a lot of stuff, right? So for me, it's almost tapping into that effortless that I'm not capable of doing too well, I in a way that I feel capable. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. You look really comfortable in it, which I feel like goes far.
Yeah, like, I mean, it's not like you barely feel it. It's so lightweight. It's just kinda I can't replicate the people that are put together and just woke up 5 minutes ago, but I think if you were to ever see me and you thought that's what I was, it would be because I was wearing something that was pleated. Yours is I have a feeling I might know yours, but how do you feel when you wear a pleat?
Yeah, so for me, pleats and we have a special relationship because not one, but both of my wedding gowns are actually pleated. And I was very torn between the two until I finally just accepted I had to have them both. Because funnily enough, they kind of fall into these two categories of pleats that we've been talking about, the kind of more structural pleats that actually shape the silhouette of the garment, and then your more plissé texture pleat that is in addition to the existing fabric. So my ceremony gown was very structured. It was a ball gown, and that had structured pleats. But then my reception gown is by Danielle Frankel. It is the rainy dress. And I remember when I put it on, I turned to my mom and I said, I feel like a Greek statue because it absolutely just touches all of what we've been talking about with this kind of Greek silhouette, the vertical pleating. It's a pleated fabric, it's silk. All the pleats gather to one cat eye corner. and then they all kind of just fall down the body. I will say I did lie. That is the one garment that I own that's pleated that I did have tailored, but I think I get a pass. And I just remember feeling so elegant and like I was wearing the dress, it wasn't wearing me. And it kind of just gave me all the feelings I wanted for our reception of being effortless and beautiful and being able to move and dance and just kind of let my body be part of the garment.
She's perfect, partly because the gown is perfect, partly because Chandler was, like, the most beautiful bride. First, one of the best parties ever. But second, we were dancing for, like, 4 hours. Like, I
Forever.
was sweating. I was sweating. I looked like a mess at the end of the night, and then there's these photos of you in this gown. It just looks perfect in every angle. We, like, lifted you on up on a chair. I just in every angle, you're wearing the gown, and you're having the best time ever, and the gown is just accentuating you. It's not even the other thing that's so special about it is it was such a beautiful piece, but it also let you shine more than, like, the garment shining itself, right? That's kinda how I looked at that.
Yeah. I think that's what drew me to it. I didn't want it to be boring, but I wanted me to be the main factor. And
As you
it
should be.
really yeah, it kind of really just hit all those feelings. Plus the craftsmanship, like when you're talking about Dior, it is so beautifully crafted. And I remember when I was getting fittings done, we had this sticky note on it that was like, "Do not iron because the pleats." I don't know how she did the pleating, but basically if you iron it, they'll all fall out and the gown will be completely ruined. You'd have to
Yeah.
remake the entire thing. But as long as you don't iron it, all the pleats stay in place and it doesn't wrinkle. It was balled up and I mean, it wasn't on the ground in a garment bag, but it was long. So the hem was balled and it was perfect when we took it out. And the silk is gorgeous. I had a train that I removed because we were wearing it while we were dancing and I made the fabric into a little bag that I carried around and it kept the pleats even when it was made into a bag. The fabric's just insane. So I will always love a pleat. Everyone should go put one on. Next time you see one in the wild, maybe you'll think of ancient Egypt and remind yourself you're the main character in your own life. Let your body be a part of the garment
Yeah, and just have fun with it, right?
for sure. I think have fun when you're getting dressed. Maybe you think of us and then you think, you know what? I'm going to go leave a rating for their
Oh,
podcast or a
maybe I'll
review.
follow. Let us know what you guys think, and we hope that yeah, we hope you enjoyed this. Send us your pleated outfits, and we'll see you back here next time.
Amazing. Love you.
Love ya.